Thank you very much. I think left out of that introduction was the fact that Christopher, over his many years, has also been one of the great characters of Parliament, one of the more entertaining, one of the more candid, which I'm sure he'll be this afternoon, but also behind the scenes, one of the most influential and effective power players in Canberra. We wouldn't have Scott Morrison as Prime Minister, can I venture, if it weren't for the work of Christopher and some of the other moderates in making sure Peter Dutton didn't get the job last year. Scott Morrison, I think by any definition, has done better than perhaps even you expected at the time. Can we start with the election earlier this year? Did you really think he could win it and would win it?
Well, I have to answer honestly, especially now that I've retired.
I could unpack that right there, but anyway.
The Thursday before the election, I always do a kind of call of the card, and I came up with 75 seats for the coalition. I think we ended up with 77, and I texted that to a few mates, including Scott Morrison, and he texted me back saying he thought I was missing this seat and that seat, and I was wrong about this one and that one, and we'd get to 77. And I thought that's pretty good. We did get to 77, so he was right on the money. But when I thought, so that was very close to the election day.
Yeah.
Did I think we could win the election going into the election? I thought it was very much a 50-50 proposition at best. But I think in the first week of the campaign, it became apparent that I thought that we would win the election because the Leader of the Opposition couldn't explain his policies. And there was a terrible interview that Jonathan Lee from Channel 10 pursued Bill in a press conference. And
this is about the cost of the climate policies.
That's right. He said, how much will your 45% emissions reduction target actually cost the economy? And Bill couldn't tell him, and Jonathan kept asking him, and it was obvious that Bill didn't know. And a little light bulb went over my head, and I thought, well, if he can't get that right by the end of the election, that's going to be very hard for them.
I want to come back to Labor because you know Anthony Albanese pretty well too.
He's one of my good friends.
There you go.
Everyone's my friend now.
Journalists included.
I draw the line there.
Oh, okay. The election itself, look, I'll get to the polling too, because I think there's a real lesson there for all concerned, and perhaps even the private sector as well when it comes to trusting polls and so on. But the election result, I mean, Scott Morrison puts it down to the quiet Australians. It did surprise many that he got there. What do you think the main message was from that election result?
Well, I think the truth is that the Australian voters tend to want to elect coalition governments at the national level, and they tend to want to elect Labor governments at the state level, because the state governments do services, and nobody ever asks them whether they've got any money. And at the federal election, they expect the government to manage the budget and manage the economy. So they tend to think the coalition's going to be better at that. I think the message from the election is that really hasn't changed in 50 years.
Even though you guys had the most chaotic few years in terms of churning through
What
leaders.
was chaotic about it?
I can't recall. It's 3 prime ministers in 3 years. Does that not matter to voters, do you think?
I think it matters a lot to voters. I think it does. But I think that they looked at the coalition and thought they seem to know how to run the economy. They seem to be getting the budget under control. That there'll be a surplus next year. That was all very believable. Scott Morrison was a very safe pair of hands. Bill Shorten energised 3 million retirees. Because even if you weren't being affected by the negative gearing changes, not just the retirees, but also the franking credits policy, you thought you might be affected or your friends were being affected. And I thought we were going to win the election when my daughter Eleanor came home, who was voting in her first election, after seeing my mother, and said, Nanny says if Labor wins, she's going to lose all of her money. Which of course is not true, by the way, but...
You didn't correct her at that point?
Well, I said that's ridiculous, of course. But the point is, millions of grandmothers across Australia are saying the same thing to their children and their grandchildren.
Their grandkids were buying it.
And they would have thought, oh, well, maybe I'm committed, maybe I'm not to a particular party, but if Granny's going to, have to move out of her flat and buy a caravan because she hasn't got any money left, then that's not good. So I think he energised the retirees, he energised the homeowners. He basically sent a message to the middle-class Australians, which is the quiet Australians, as Scott calls them, that they were going to have their money taken away and redistributed to other people by huge taxes, and this guy, Bill, couldn't explain their policies, and I think that frightened people. And the message out of the election is that people expect to, have a sound, solid economy run by people who seem to know what they're doing, and they want to keep as much of their money as they can. They'll pay their taxes, but they don't want to be taxed out of existence.
So Anthony Albanese then, I mean, they're still going through their formal policy review, but it's pretty clear they're not going to stick with some of, the franking credit policy as it is.
I hope they do.
I don't think they will. Do you expect we'll see a very different direction under Albanese?
I think it's very tricky for Anthony, actually, because, he's from the left of the Labor Party, so he's quite left-wing. He's happy being photographed with Jeremy Corbyn, for example, and Bernie Sanders. And I know him very well, and he's a true believer. He's not a fair-weather lefty. So
that is who he is.
That's who he is. He has got a log cabin story. He did grow up in very tough circumstances, and
single mum, housing commission.
Single mum in a housing commission flat. Found out that his dad was still alive when he was about 52, having been told he'd been killed in a car accident when he was a child. And he's a great guy, Anthony, but it's going to be very hard for him to pretend or to wear the clothes of a fiscal conservative, because I don't think he believes all that. And he's been lucky to be the the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, because it's kind of a non-ideological area. You are delivering big projects.
It's an interesting point. You don't think he's had enough time in the more political roles?
Well, he hasn't had to have his feet to the fire on the Adani mine, for example, or China and the South China Sea, and all of these issues where ideology starts to become more important.
And trains and roads, who doesn't love
Well, everyone
bridges?
loves trains and roads and bridges and so on. And so that he's been lucky to be in those. I think he chose those portfolios deliberately for that reason.
Interesting. But he is obviously going to try to reposition Labor from where they were at the election. You just don't think people will buy it because it's not him.
Well, he's got a lot to throw out, that's to start with, and then what's he going to be left with? And then he's got to convince people that whatever platform he takes to the polls in 3 years is one that he genuinely believes in.
Let's talk about the polls. They were wrong.
Authenticity was a big part of the election.
Authenticity is one of the things you can't fake in politics, as we've seen. The polls, they were wrong. They were badly wrong and wrong. I think there were 16 opinion polls through the campaign, and all of them had Labor winning on a two-party preferred result. Ipsos got close on the primary votes in the final survey, but generally they were wrong. Do you think it's clear yet why they were wrong and whether we should ever trust opinion polls again?
Opinion polls have been wrong in the Western democracies for a decade. Hillary Clinton was so confident of winning she didn't even campaign in places like Wisconsin and Michigan. Nick Xenophon was supposed to be the Premier of South Australia 18 months ago. He was out-polling Stephen Marshall and Jay Weatherill, not as preferred Premier, as a political party. He didn't even win his own seat. We weren't supposed to win this election. I think that the New South Wales election the polls weren't very close. I think the reason the polls don't work anymore is because people don't spend enough money on them. So people are too cheap.
The media's too cheap?
There isn't enough money in the media, so they can't spend money on polling.
Wouldn't it be better to do less of them and get them right?
It would be better to do less of them and do them more comprehensively, interview more people, and go into their houses. And this is important stuff because people make decisions about who the Prime Minister should be based on polls.
Well, apparently so. Apparently so.
And that's bizarre
just explain
in itself.
that for us, because a lot of people might say, let's just get rid of polls. We're too poll-driven in our politics. The media is too focused. And
How do you get rid of polls?
But you do need them, don't you?
Well, you can't get rid of them because it's a democracy. So people have got to be entitled to take a poll if they want to. It's a question of educating people not to pay any attention to them.